A paper by Pope Francis called an Apostolic Exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, is causing confusion among Catholic leaders and the lay people alike. The concern over it has rocked the church and seems to be calling into question this idea of bishops and lower-level priests respecting the Pope's authority. Some background first. So overwhelmingly, Catholic leaders are concerned with the destruction of the Western family. Divorce rates are particularly high. This is not an issue that's unique to Catholicism, obviously. I think if you asked any church leader, they would probably indicate that the destruction of the family unit is toward the top of the list of their primary concern. The destruction of the Western family is a particular issue, though, as it relates to how Catholics worship. The Lord's Supper is celebrated as a religious sacrament that Catholics call Eucharist. It's part of the regular weekly service called Mass. They believe it has the power to forgive sin, and by its makeup, it's a particularly holy and actual experience with Jesus Christ for those that happen to be Catholic. In order to have the Eucharist, a Catholic must be in good standing, have gone to confession once in the last year, and must be married to one person only. For other denominations, which in America are predominantly Protestant, I know there are exceptions, the Lord's Supper is one of two biblical ordinances given for all believers. Do this in remembrance of me. In that Protestant view, all people are sinners, regardless of what the sin is, and all can participate in the Lord's Supper if that individual has prayed and believes themselves to be in a state of grace. It is subjective. So if the individual feels they have made the necessary steps and are in that state of grace, they can then approach and participate in the Lord's Supper. Only in Catholicism is there the limitation on the Lord's Supper of married to one person. You can't have remarried. You can't be in a state of divorce without an annulment from the church. And you can't be living with somebody that you're not married with. If you, in fact, meet those criteria in the Catholic Church, you cannot take the Eucharist. So the Catholic tradition is first laid out in the Fourth Lateran Council in the year 1215 A.D., and that's where this idea of transubstantiation, the idea that Jesus Christ actually becomes the bread and wine, that's where this idea is born. Other denominations, particularly some conferences of Lutherans, they believe that Jesus is present during the ceremony, but not that he actually becomes the elements. So what could possibly be so concerning about Amoris Laetitia in regards to the Eucharist? The document has over 300 paragraphs and discusses many topics. The Worcester Bishop, Robert MacMannus, points out the three most reoccurring words in the Amoris Laetitia document. They are accompaniment, integration, and discernment. So particularly according to paragraph 300, Amoris Laetitia wants the parish priest to accompany individuals in these irregular situations of being divorced without an annulment, having remarried, or living with an individual to whom you are not married, to be accompanied through this process of finding a state of grace. So the exact wording that's used is irregular situations where there is a disconnect between the objective reality of the magisterium and the subjective culpability of the individual. So basically, does the individual believe themselves to be sinning or not? So it's quite interesting. So for example, if a divorcee remarries and remains in some form of practice a Catholic, identifies as a Christian, and doesn't believe in their hearts they're engaged in subjective immorality, the priest is to guide them to the process of re-engaging the faith sacraments, which, according to Amoris Laetitia, may include the Eucharist. Now, before you say, whoa, that's messed up, or that's wicked, or the world's going to fall apart, or that's unbiblical, let me point out two things to you. Firstly, every denomination of Christianity, from Catholicism to the Independent Baptist Church down the street, allows the individuals participating in the Lord's Supper to subjectively determine their fitness to do it. If I sit there before the ceremony and I pray and I say, please God, forgive me, and then I come to a belief in my heart that because of Christ's sacrifice and my remembrance of it in that moment, that I am then fit to participate. Strangely, it's the Catholic Church that seems to have the rigid standards for who and who cannot participate. Number two, so one might say, well, the Bible plainly points to what we're supposed to do in the case of the Lord's Supper. Well, yes, that's true, but not every Christian denomination subscribes to biblical authority. The Catholic Church relies on two pillars, tradition and Scripture. And the Pope is the infallible authority of the Catholic Church, not the Bible. One of the things being called into question by Amoris Laetitia is this idea of papal infallibility. 45 theologians wrote a letter to Pope Francis asking him to clarify his remarks. 4 bishops sent a letter to Pope Francis asking him to clarify his remarks. So the infallibility issue, the Pope has been the final authority since Vatican I and Pope Pius IX. But it used to be that only when the Pope spoke ex cathedra was his infallibility in place. But in modern times, that's certainly not the case. It's implied that he's infallible all the time. A perfect example of that is when Pope Francis totally undermined Bishop Gerhard Mueller's leadership and the usual boundaries in place to fire 3 of his most well-loved CDC priests that had spoken out against him. So Pope Francis opens the door for divorced, remarried, and those living together unmarried to have the Eucharist. According to Amoris Laetitia, by a process of discernment on a case-by-case basis, parish priests accompany the individual back to these sacraments. And remember, it's not doctrine. Pope Francis left himself that out, with Amoris Laetitia being some sort of vision statement suggesting that lower-level clergy think a certain way. So 4 cardinals, ironically Argentinian cardinals, sent Pope Francis a Dubia. A Dubia is a, hey Pope, can you please explain your position letter? Noting that the church teaches the exact opposite to what he's saying, and his language appears in the footnotes below, specifically what Pope Francis said. So in it, Pope Francis confirmed his intention to do exactly what he said he was going to do in Amoris Laetitia. So it's really not that unclear. The issue is that it's totally contrary to the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church. So interestingly, the document was also not probably intended for distribution. It was leaked from the Vatican, which points to 2 interesting things. One, it points to the disjunct relationship and disunity that we would expect from the Roman Curia. And it also points to how good of a papal politician Pope Francis is. His words in Amoris Laetitia are a complete departure from the teachings of the Church. But he's leaving future popes the option of choosing directions. For example, Amoris Laetitia builds on the foundation built by Pope John Paul II in 1981 at his synod, Familiaris Consortio, which starts to begin moving toward this Western globalist idea of the family. And so Pope Francis is going to do the same thing for his successors. Why is he teaching this, though? I can give you my opinion. This is not new. If one studies the history of Christianity, particularly the Church, and you look at the couple dozen ecumenical councils, you find a few common occurrences. One of those common occurrences is the Church's self-reflection on how it has been so successful in temporal affairs, but wants to return to this idea of, a past pure spiritual authority that it probably never really had, but it's consistent. You see simony, people not elected to church office, by their process, their education, their calling, but secular leaders basically being given spiritual positions. We also see instances of sexual misconduct. For more detail on that subject particularly, watch my video on the 7 reasons for decline of the modern American church. It offers statistics that I gathered from various sources. So my point is, in the Vatican's own dealing with the sexual misconduct issue, they hired psychologists who came in and did a long-term, highly academic scientific study, and they determined the reason for the sexual misconduct to be forced celibacy. And I find that interesting because I think Francis is laying the groundwork for a future pope, and it may be decades down the road, to finally do away with this forced celibacy for Catholic priests. And I think Amoris Laetitia is a move in that direction. I think it presupposes the continued development of globalism in our world. I think it presupposes the church's continued move toward ecumenism and theosophism, which is the governing philosophy of the UN. It happens to take Jesus Christ and all the other world religions and put them together in this hodgepodge of I'm okay, you're okay, it's all the same God, the only standards being very basic moral standards that ironically the UN determines and not God. So theosophism, this catch-all philosophy, unfortunately what it does to Christianity, and so does Amoris Laetitia, it seems to alienate true Christians in the Catholic Church for whom the word of Jesus Christ are gospel. Their choice to either leave Catholicism or make another mark in the column of things I don't like about my religion, but I'm going to stay because my denomination is still better than the one down the street. A way of thinking that American Christianity has to get away from if we're going to survive. Unfortunately, and even though it's just Catholic and not broad to Christianity, Amoris Laetitia represents one of the last few places that actually had some Christian standards in this world being eroded. And I think that's the biggest problem for most people. Divorce, remarriage, and living together unmarried, technical biblical fornication and adultery have already become normalized in our culture. I'll leave it to your imagination what happens next. Anyway, sorry to end on such a somber note. I will tell you that right now I'm finishing up working on a video of the period of time between the First and Second Holy Land Crusade in early 12th century Europe. And also I'm preparing, I saw an article at the end of last week that the Catholic Church has refused now to allow gluten-free products in the elements that make up the Eucharist. And I have quite a humorous video coming out on that note later this week. So I want to thank you guys for continuing to watch my videos. That support means a great deal to me, and it motivates me to work more, study more, read more, and continue on the path that I believe God has chosen for me. Really appreciate you all, and feel free to leave comments, likes, share, subscribe, whatever you want to do. Look forward to talking to you next time.